we have, I'm looking forward.
I'm going to sit on the left, and he's going to sit on the right.
On the right.
Good. All right, there you go.
How far right should I go? Like over,
I'm not very far.
Okay, not very far. We're both close to the center, for the record. For the record.
You know, for those of you who came last year, we had a similar panel set up, and I think it was probably one of the best sessions we had because it involved just open discussion. And I'm going to ask a series of questions, but I think the thrust of this is that we really want Melanie and Rich to engage with one another and ask each other's questions, but more importantly, we have 45 minutes. And we hope the majority of this time is spent with you engaging with our panelists, because that's where we think the true flavor of this dialogue comes. You guys have been sitting here all day, and as I came in, I said, everyone still felt excited, but the energy level. So this is our time to get engaged. So I'm going to start us off, but first by just saying to Melanie and Rich, thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're both sought after. I was listening to some of your side conversations and all the commitments that you turned down and all the commitments that you still have to go to for the remainder of just this week. So thank you very much. So let me get us started. And it would be great to level set regarding the base assumption that underlies this discussion: the need to pursue decarbonization of our economy. Whether you consider decarbonization a global environmental imperative or a potential competitive advantage, do you both agree that pursuing some level of decarbonization of our economy is a worthy endeavor? And if so, how far should we go and how fast should we go? So, ladies first. I'm going to start with Melanie.
You're talking to me?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Sorry. Of course, I think that decarbonization is an imperative, and the fourth assessment, I'm sure everyone here has sat down and read it cover to cover. IPCC detailed the difference between 2 degrees warming and 1.5 degrees warming. And I think that the people need to understand the huge difference just in a half a degree temperature difference. And it suggests to me several things. Urgency becomes very important when every tenth of a degree matters. And so I approach our pathways to decarbonization from the position of what can we do now, what can we do consistently, what should we be investing in for the future, because we cannot get there from here where we are now, but we need to start now and stop fighting over it, and I think it's an imperative. So.
Yeah, thank you. Rich?
Is this where I'm supposed to disagree and
Not
say?
at all. This is one of those maybe.
I'll say I agree. I think completely with Melanie. It's an enormous priority, both because this is a matter of global environmental concern and impact on global communities, especially marginalized communities around the world that are the least prepared to deal with the impacts of climate change, and because it's a significant competitive advantage for the United States if we can get ahead on some of these technologies. In terms of export opportunities right now, we are woefully behind some of our competitors, and so I think that there's a real chance. When you say kind of how far, how fast, the one constraint I would put on how far, how fast is what can we do, how far, how fast can we go that maintains affordability and reliability in the various energy sectors. And I say that not as a matter of principle so much as a matter of practicality. When we see places try to go faster than that, we often see significant and often counterproductive backlash from whatever the local population it is that's reacting to whatever that policy was. So we see the yellow vest protests in France, or the dissolution of the government in Ecuador, or the contribution of the dissolution of the government in Chile, and all these places. And so finding the ways where we can go as fast as possible while preserving affordability and reliability. I think that's really different by sector.
Right.
I mean, U.S. electric utility sector, heck, Exelon's there, effectively. I think the membership of EEI, I think collectively is set to do 50% reduction by 2030 or so, and net zero by 2050. There may be some EEI members who would disagree with that, and I apologize if any of you are in the room. But I think that that's probably where y'all are going to end up going. Transportation will be harder. Passenger vehicles might be faster than all that, and heavy-duty freight is probably going to be slower than that. We're going to have to rely more on the net in net zero in some of those other sectors. And clearly, the United States is well ahead of a lot of other economies around the world in doing this. I'd say in the rest of the world, priority one is staunch the bleeding, right? Pakistan today is building subcritical coal plants with the help of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, right? So principle one, to get yourself out of a hole is to stop digging, right? In many parts of the world, we're still digging. And so first we need to do that, and then we can talk about how fast and how effectively we can decarbonize.
Thank you. So let's talk about that. You talk about the energy sector. What are the relative roles that you see today and tomorrow for gas, nuclear, solar, wind, hydros? How do you see that playing into it? And so continue on your conversation, Rich, and then I'll come to Melanie on that, please.
So we need all of these things. I think we are mercifully moving away from, I'll call them kind of juvenile discussions about 100% renewables or something like that. The idea that we could accomplish everything with a single technology has been not only shown, dozens of times as a, not the best affordable, reliable way to decarbonize a power grid, but also certainly as something that's not terribly inclusive to all the communities that you got to convince to go forward.
Real quick,
Yep.
California this morning talked about going 100% renewable in real time, and what do you think?
Great. Great. I mean, in a incredibly rich place like California that appears to have a truly unusual appetite for spending more and more money on their power sector, and who, by the way, is connected to all kinds of other resources. So 100% renewable in California might not be 100% renewable in California, but sort of by accounting tricks and imported electrons, 100% renewable. Sure, potentially possible there. I do think California made a huge step in the right direction with SB 100 passed last year, which took that 60% renewable as sort of the ceiling for the renewable only mandate, and then moved to a technology neutral target for the rest of the way. Now, they might end up going a lot of the rest of the way. I mean, the crazy thing about California is if everything was just counted as clean right now, that 60%, effectively wind and solar, plus the 17% hydro they currently have, plus Diablo Canyon, another 8%, that would be an 85% clean, by 2030 if they just counted all of that. But that's, that wasn't the compromise. So, yeah.
If
Melanie,
I could say,
please.
we did a lengthy study of California. We released it in May of this year. It did not, it was not a policy analysis. We didn't make policy recommendations. We assumed California's policies. And we looked at 2030 and 2050. In 2017 in California, there were a total of 90 days with no wind. So 1/4 of the year, there was no wind. There was 10, 11 days in a row with no wind. There were other periods over the course of the year with 7, 8, 9 days with no wind. And so that's one data point. We also looked at seasonal variation in California. The wind and solar peak in the summer there and trough in the winter. The delta between the two of them is 3.1 terawatt hours. Yes, more than many countries. 3.1 terawatt hours is the difference between summer generation and winter generation for wind and solar. Then you look at, EIA looked at battery storage in CalISO. It's got 150, this was maybe a year ago, 150 megawatts of 4 hours duration storage. and our conclusion from that was that you need fuel in addition to the wind and solar. And I would say one other thing on hydro in California, obviously they import a lot of hydro from Canada, Washington, and Oregon. When you look at the impacts of climate change on hydro generation in that part of the world, you're going to see over the course of the century at least a 20% decline in hydro generation, so because of climate change. And so we were, again, conclusion was California, you can meet your 60% by 2030, but you're going to need a fuel to still reliably run your grid.
Okay.
And so.
Okay, thank you. So in the nation's capital, federal government, I'd love to get your take on what is the role of the federal government as we promote this clean energy standard. And one of the thoughts is, how about a federal clean energy standard? That's the question. And then two, do we need a price on carbon to really push this agenda forward? And I'll start with you, Melanie.
I do think we need a price on carbon. We spent a lot of time looking at the Baker-Schultz fee and dividend, where the tax fundamentally on carbon gets returned to everyone in the country. It makes it a very progressive tax. And the only question I have about fee and dividend and Baker-Schultz is what is the fee? How much do you pay? And at some level, it might only affect the electricity sector, depending on how high it is. Electricity sector is not easy, but is the easiest sector to decarbonize, which is why everyone focuses on electricity. And so if you have a fee and dividend that only affects electricity, in the US, 27% of our emissions are from power generation. What about the other 73%? We tend to obsess on electricity and forget the other carbon emissions because it's harder. So.
Rich, thoughts?
So we focus on making clean energy cheaper, not traditional energy more expensive. And that's both because there's a clearer, broader political pathway to doing that. And it's also the suite of policies that, at least to date, have the best track record in actually driving decarbonization in our economy. So if you look at, for example, in the last decade, right, we had one major decarbonizing factor, right, the deployment of wind and solar, that was driven by a whole suite of policies, right? So renewable portfolio standards, so mandates in the states, plus federal procurement policies, plus federal tax incentives, plus corporate procurement commitments, plus state policies, and I can go on and on. And we had another technology, the coal to gas switch, which was not supported really by any of those in the last decade. Of course, it was supported by some of those things, a lot of basic and applied R&D and the alternative production credit, and a lot of state regulatory reform in the 2000s. And the one of those that had far less policy support and no mandate supplied 2/3 of the decarbonization, right? Despite all of the policy support on the other side, which shows you that if we can find higher performing, more affordable, flexible clean energy technologies, there's actually a huge potential for those to deploy themselves via the markets.
So Rich, what I hear you say, and let me ask, the subsidies that are currently underway supporting wind, solar, and light, we don't need anymore?
Yes, I would say that.
Okay.
I'd say that. Now, I will say, though, for those technologies, I think, once you've got, certainly for wind, right? We are deep into the territory where wind should be able to stand on its own 2 feet or not. Solar, you could make an argument that it may be in some places or some forms of solar. What we support and are much more interested in is either technology-specific incentives with automatic ramp downs for new technologies. So we were very supportive of the 45Q tax incentive for carbon capture and storage. That's not a technology that we have already deployed at the gigawatt scale, right? That's something that we need to do a lot of learning by doing to radically bring down the price. And we're also very supportive of efforts. So, Tom Reed from New York, for example, has this proposal to put in place a permanent technology neutral tax incentive that any new technology could take advantage of, start with really high ITCs and then have a down ramp of PTCs as the technology matured. But we need to be off-ramping technologies and seeing whether they succeed or fail in the market, because if something needs to be permanently subsidized, we can't expect a Nigeria or an Indonesia or a Bangladesh to permanently subsidize clean energy in their markets. We need technologies that are so good you could actually imagine them being like-for-like substitutes to subcritical coal in the developing world. And in our view, the role of the U.S. is to be a test bed for all those technologies, and so we need policies that sort of align with that and sort of treat that as those. In our view.
So I saw Melanie, please.
On both the natural gas and the natural gas revolution in the U.S. and on solar, the Department of Energy started in 1978 in response to the Arab oil embargoes, blah, blah, blah. One of the first things it did was invest in characterizing shale basins. And so that's in 1978. It also invested very heavily in solar R&D after it was started. That was one of its big focus areas. And as you said, I was at the Gas Technology Institute and spent a lot of time analyzing, and at MIT we did as well, how the shale gas revolution came about. So DOE invests in shale basin characterization. The Gas Research Institute, which was a surcharge placed on pipeline volumes of gas when we had a completely regulated gas industry. So that was it partnered with the Department of Energy and FERC. FERC had a very light oversight over the GRI. Spent $200 million a year in R&D. And over a course of 10, 15 years on shale gas development, specifically $160 million in partnership with DOE. And there was a Section 29 tax credit, a time-limited tax credit, and all of that was what brought about the shale gas revolution. Took a very long period of time. I would say the same thing about solar. So
your view is that it's necessary, but who is to determine that length of time? Because
we need to speed it up.
We need to speed it up.
Yeah.
You both bring up an interesting point. Rich, you brought up New York and the model of investing, encouraging companies to invest and so forth in technology and the like. And you just talked about DOE and the shale gas. What is the role, in your view, of the federal government in encouraging innovation and partnering with private industry to drive innovation? Does the federal government still have a role in this? Melanie, to just piggyback off what you just said.
I think absolutely the federal government has a role in it, and I think that it's changing. It does invest a huge amount in basic research, but I'm not sure that basic research is not all that the federal government needs to be doing right now. It needs to, and the DOE loan program is an example, moving into different spaces. ARPA-E, another example. ARPA-E has been wildly successful. The loan program as well. The loans, the failure rate for the loan program at DOE is much lower than in the private sector, in spite of the bad name that Solyndra got at one point in time. But those are filling, I think, critical roles now that we need filled in transitioning our energy systems, which somebody came up to me before we started why can't we do this quickly, And I said, well, the energy industry, multi-trillion-dollar, highly capitalized global industries that heavily regulated, affecting all aspects of life. That creates a system with a lot of inertia. And you need the power, you need to start thinking about these things very seriously, systematically, in order to make the transition that we need. And the government plays a huge role in that. So.
Rich?
So I'd say 4 things.
Please.
Research and demonstration, both basic and applied research, all the way through demonstration and kind of full toolkit demonstration. So the use of things like the Loan Program Office to burn through the risk and get steel in the ground, go from 0 to 1 with a lot of these things, 1. Thing 2, early incentives to create markets for these things. So that could be tax incentives or that could be federal procurement. Federal government buys a heck of a lot of electricity. In other sectors, the federal government buys even more steel and concrete. So when we start to think about all of the other sectors in the economy, the federal government could play an even greater role there in procurement. Thing 3 is getting the federal government the heck out of the way in the places where it stands in the way of deploying a lot of this stuff. And that's all over the place, right? So licensing an advanced nuclear reactor in this country is an extremely challenging proposition, which NuScale is doing in record time, only 40 months to license a new design. And then, of course, it'll be months and months more than that to get its COLA to actually build one of the things. So finding a way to speed up that process or license or relicense hydropower facilities or figure out renewables on public lands in a more expeditious way. And then 4th, export support, right? So when we think about the developing world, very little is being built in the developing world without the support of an export credit agency from somewhere. A lot of that is the Chinese export credit agencies right now. As I mentioned earlier, they'll sell people anything. So if they want to buy Chinese solar panels, they're happy to sell them. And if they want to buy Chinese subcritical coal plants, they'll sell them that too. We're effectively out of that game, right? So we haven't had an authorized export-import bank with a quorum in a while. We're just coming around to having something in the form of the USIDFC, the International Development Finance Corporation, authorized last year by the BUILD Act, which is going to evolve OPIC into a structure that can actually do something like that. But we do not have any kind of coordinated sort of Team USA, all-of-government effort by the United States to combat sort of the, this cheap and very dirty coal that's being built around a lot of the rest of the world.
Please.
I think getting the government out of the way, it does delay things. The public delays a lot of things too.
Also true.
Yes, the public
Also true.
delays,
We should just get rid of the public.
Well, I think we should, and the federal government, no.
That was a joke.
Yes.
That was a joke. For the
I
record,
didn't say it.
That was a
He
joke.
did.
Yeah.
Okay. But the NIMBYism. People talk about how difficult it is to cite. And we when we were at DOE in the Obama administration, we did approve Clean Line, got things going. It still failed because of opposition in key states. Getting pipelines, gas pipelines, extremely difficult. And somebody's complaining to me about how long we can't get the gas pipeline done. And I said, how long has Cape Wind taken? That's not because of government problems. That's because of public opposition. Right. And there's a lot of opposition to infrastructure that we need to figure out and accommodate in our schedules as well. And I think it is equally as dilatory, quite frankly, as some of the government actions. So.
I have several more questions I could ask, but I want to make sure before I go and turn it over to the audience to see if you have any burning questions that's on your mind you want to ask our panelists. Anyone?
Can I build on one?
And we'll get you a mic.
When we talk about technologies and which one should be in the mix and all that.
Please.
To Melanie's point, I think for a long time folks waved away the idea that energy density of technology was a serious concern. NIMBYism really makes energy density a serious concern, right? So whether that's finding ways to site new advanced reactors on the site of existing facilities where you already kind of have community buy-in, or cracking enhanced geothermal that wouldn't have a really broad footprint and you could put almost anywhere, we need to figure out what the premium is that we're willing to pay for energy density, because it may be the only thing we're able to build in the future.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. And if you wouldn't mind, could you introduce yourself and who you represent?
Hi, yes, I'm Amy Davidson. I'm with the Climate
hear
Group.
you.
Can you hear me?
Well, I can't hear anything, but go ahead.
Okay.
I'm getting old, no.
Actually, I'm going to address this to Rich anyway, but Melanie, you can jump in. Rich, I'd just love to hear like the vision that the Republican Party has to get to net zero emissions by 2050. And there's certainly an argument when we look, that's a global goal. And so many folks think the U.S. has to move even faster than that goal. So what is the vision? I mean, you talked about a couple pieces of it, but I'm not quite sure how you actually get there with those pieces.
Well, so while I am a Republican, I'm not sure I speak on behalf of the Republican Party. So with that disclaimer, I'll say a couple of things. First, I do think a lot of people share the ambition to get to net zero by 2050, either in the U.S. or globally. I think that there's significant confusion around that goal. Like that's not exactly the goal laid out in the Paris Agreement, for example. And so I think there's confusion about why we need to go faster than the global ambition of the Paris Agreement, for example, right? Folks feel like net zero by 2050 or 1.5 degrees were sort of sudden developments that there wasn't actually significant kind of U.S. sign-off on and that were forced by other parts of the developing world. I'm not saying anything about the value of doing that. I would love to stabilize the atmosphere at 1.5 degrees. But I think people continue to have significant questions about the viability of doing that with those other constraints in mind, affordability and reliability. And again, that's not saying that affordability and reliability are sacred in some way. It's simply saying that they appear to be practical constraints to how fast any country is willing to go on all this. So with all that said, I think a lot of people are aligned with that sort of that vision, that direction. And I think folks are, again, very open to expanded R&D on all this stuff to bring down the costs of the technology here and globally. Folks will note that the FY18 and FY19 spending bills for the Department of Energy, for example, were the largest ever investments in DOE, outside of the stimulus, which was a kind of a one-time spike. So you had a Republican Congress and a Republican president sort of invest in that. I think folks are very open to tax incentives. The 45J and 45Q incentives were both passed in the last Congress, again by Republican Congress with a Republican president. And right now, we're seeing in a bipartisan way negotiations of it changes by the hour. Some suite, maybe someone in the room can tell me what the current status is, but some suite of extenders on a few of these things. Obviously, regulatory reform is the sort of the bread and butter of the Republicans in all this. They probably are significantly more aggressive on a lot of those things than their Democratic counterparts. And increasingly, Republicans are open on the sort of the export supports piece as well. So I think folks are very comfortable with that agenda, and I think it has some claim to actually developing a suite of technologies that not just decarbonize the U.S., but actually have some answer on the Pakistans and the Bangladeshs of the world. I think if there's a place where proposals like, say, the Green New Deal have fallen short, is that they say very, very little about the applicability of the technology suite to the rest of the world. And while they might be interesting, although extremely expensive ways to decarbonize the United States by 2050, they really might not get us to actually solving the bigger problem that we both agree on, right? To actually getting to global stabilization of temperatures.
So Melanie, would you like to speak for the Republican Party?
No. A couple of things I would say that, and I was going to, you mentioned the Green New Deal. We actually...
Unlike the much more practical Green Real Deal.
Thank you. You just stole my line.
Yeah, sorry.
We've actually been working together for a long time, okay? But the Green Real Deal, which Green New Deal is a resolution. Resolution in its structure and on its face is aspirational. It's not law. It's not it's not drafting statute. It's an aspiration. And we actually the Green Real Deal has a set of principles, and business model, technology, policy innovation, social equity. A really important one is coalition building. And as one of our principles for a practical, the Green Real Deal. And so much so that Joe Heesier, another principal in our organization, and I got a call from a professor at GW University. he had read the Green Real Deal. The thing that he liked about it the most was the coalition building aspect of it, and wants us to come talk about the coalitions that we build. Rich and I spend a lot of our time doing that. I think that's essential, and I think that the deniers on the one hand in the climate debate, and the magical thinkers on the other hand in the climate debate, who say it's all going to be wind and solar in 10 years, and in my view that's magical thinking, are actually delaying action when I think action is urgently needed. And the net zero that you were talking about, and people talking about net zero and not being consistent with Paris, the reason they are now moving to net zero is because science has learned more since Paris. And I think that people are starting to actually see the impacts of climate change. We just saw Puerto Rico flattened, with the wildfires in California. Things are becoming visible. And I think that's coalition building, actually, because people, both sides are seeing that it's happening.
Yes, ma'am.
Being the Californian in the room, Angelina Galitova, California ISO Board of Governors, I did want to correct you on SB 100 because I was part of drafting SB 100 as well. Yes, it does call for 60% on the RPS, not including large hydro, which should be included, or behind the meter solar, which is growing exponentially as 10,000 rooftops without a mandate per month, and then now with a mandate of all new construction incorporating solar. So we're going to see a lot more renewables. I agree with you that we do need a plethora of technologies. You need to have geothermal. We need to rely on the hydro. We need to have regional integration in cases of building the grid. We need to be able to harness offshore wind. We need distributed energy. We need microgrids. We need new technology drivers. We don't need nuclear. Nuclear is being shut down. Our biggest failure was investing $700 million into upgrading Sun on off-rev, only for it to leak. All of the nuclear power plants that have been proposed have been over budget exponentially, and there's problems with it that we all know. It leads to proliferation. It leads to the haves versus the have-nots. So let's not go into nuclear power. The last nuclear station
I was with you until that last point.
into California will be closing in 2023, which is Diablo Canyon, sitting on 3 fault lines. That is a problem on the coast of California as well. So SB 100 does call for 100% renewable energy. If you look at it in context of SB 32, which is the Clean Air Law, which requires 80% reductions of CO2 emissions below 1990 levels by 2045, which means the answer at the back of the book is not only is the electricity sector 100% renewable, but transportation, the building sector, as well as fuel decarbonization as well. So we need to be looking at everything as a unison and as a symphony, and with the objective of exporting these technologies so that the developing world can leapfrog into the new reality and not make our mistakes. A very good initiative in Paris was the Under 2 MOU, which required under 2 C-degree increase in temperatures and under 2 tons per capita CO2 emissions. Talking of Bangladesh and Pakistan, here in the US, we have 11 tons per capita of CO2 emissions. Bangladesh and Pakistan below 2. So they've already reached their goal. We don't need to be jumping on those people. We need to be helping them stay clean. And right now, we're not investing in new technologies because the central banks like to invest in big centralized power stations. It'll be better for them to clean up. I grew up in Tanzania, East Africa, with no electricity. The easiest solution was microgrids, solar panels, local resources, biofuels, and now we can bring in 20th century education and we can bring in electric transportation along with it. Let's do that, and let's not go back into the dangerous technologies that caused Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, and everything else. We don't need to, it's expensive, and we have good alternatives. So let's make it happen.
Can I say?
Please,
Yep.
please.
So I sense we're just never going to agree on nuclear, so I won't go there. But 2 questions. So you though definitively would say that hydropower should be counted as a renewable resource, and it's a mistake in SB 100 that it wasn't counted?
They only count 30 megawatts.
Large hydro.
Large hydro, yeah, large
doesn't
hydro,
count.
yeah. So we agree completely on that, right? But then, would you read SB 100 as disqualifying a natural gas plant with carbon capture?
Yes.
Really? I'd love to learn more about that after that. I think that is and I think EFI has found that is a very, very short-sighted move by California if that solution is off the table. That might well be the lowest cost compliance.
California can't reach its goals without carbon capture and sequestration. So it's 2030 goals. 2050 goals in our analysis, 2050 goals, we don't believe that we have the technologies yet for California to actually meet the goals. But you brought up Africa and where we have also done a study, and this is just it's forecasts. By 2050, Nigeria becomes the third most populous country in the world. The world will be adding, by 2030, 10 cities of 10 million or more people by 2030. 4 of them will be in Africa. You are not going to power a city, a new city of 10 million people, or Cairo with 15 million people, et cetera, with rooftop solar panels. It'll make a huge difference in rural Africa, where 4 hours of electricity means something very different for people's lives. But with those kinds of population numbers, I think you're going to need central power stations, and we need to capture the carbon from them if they're not nuclear. So.
Anyone else? Yes, ma'am, and then we'll come here.
Hi, I'm Kathy Magruder with the Maryland Clean Energy
Can't hear.
Center. I'm interested, Melanie,
I can't.
I got you.
innovative new technologies that are on the horizon that we're not even really talking about, and how much, thank you, Steve, how much the federal government should.
Kathy, could you
Yes.
repeat that for me, please?
we couldn't
Thank
I'm
you.
Kathy Magruder with the Maryland Clean Energy Center. I'm
Thank you.
interested in the conversation we're having about carbon capture and reuse. I'm interested in new technologies that are on the horizon that we're not even really seeing in the mainstream discussion right now, but are being developed in labs and could be game changers in the future. What kind of public policy investment incentives should we be endorsing to move those technologies in to help solve the problem of decarbonizing the grid?
Well, we actually just released all we do is studies. That's what we do, okay? So I understand, but we released a study on carbon dioxide removal. And I think that investing in carbon dioxide removal, it's a recommendation for a 10-year, it's $1 billion a year, $10 billion program. We think that in the end, you're going to need CDR technologies to get to net zero. Getting to zero without carbon dioxide removal will be next to impossible. And I would say one other thing about, I think carbon capture and storage, we basically have some commercial plants in the world doing carbon CCUS, and the Southeast Asia is building coal plants at an unbelievably rapid rate, and so much so that I had the staff at EFI calculate for me the emissions from coal plants under construction, actually not announced projects, plants that were under construction in the world. And the emissions from those plants alone is equal to the emissions of the UK every year. And so we need, that's why we can't be solely focused on what we would like to see here, wind and solar and renewable technologies. We need other technologies to deal with the rest of the world. And it's an export opportunity as well. Rich mentioned that earlier, so.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Todd Glass, Wilson Sonsini. With regard to the topic of the best policies to decarbonize the grid, what role does competition play in decarbonizing the grid? At a wholesale level or even at a retail level, retail choice, these types of things? Because in a way, just the technologies are not going to make things happen. And really in this country in the last 15 years, we haven't had a whole lot of development or further development of such competition. But this competition, is it part of the toolbox?
I'll say I'm a skeptic is a strong word. I'm agnostic on competition, right? I think it's often used as a proxy for decarbonizing. I think that maybe over the last decade, that was true, right, in the wholesale power markets, because it facilitated all this kind of rapid coal to gas switching. We're beginning to see decreasing marginal returns on that, right? So most of the old real clunkers are gone. Clearly, markets that favor zero marginal cost resources and dispatch them first are great for, zero marginal cost renewables. But, to the extent that those markets and the current design is now, and Calvin will probably be happy to hear me say this, are now putting at risk, I've received no support from Exelon, I should know, are now putting at risk existing zero-emission baseload plants, which are 20% of the power in the country and more than 50% of the carbon-free power in the country. I think competition has a sort of a reckoning coming with it, and I think we're going to have to think about how to run a wholesale market in some different way, which doesn't disadvantage those plants if we're going to continue to see competition as a decarbonizing force. And then I'll just also say, we've now seen these significant voluntary decarbonizing commitments from a lot of the, traditionally integrated, regulated utilities, and we're seeing them move pretty fast. In many cases, I think Excel is going to be 80% carbon reduction by 2030. I'm not sure how many of the deregulated wholesale market players have 80% reductions by 2030. So it's not clear to me that competition is some kind of a proxy for decarbonization. And in some cases, I think it can help. Some cases, I think it might hurt.
I actually have found myself questioning my sanity because I was in the Clinton administration when we started the electricity restructuring discussion.
Yes.
And that, lots of wounds and arrows and, rocks thrown over that. But I think, this is where I question my sanity, I'm going to say it anyway, we need to step back and do a serious relook at the electricity market structure in this country. Think about what's changed since 1999 in electricity and in technology and digitalization and cybersecurity and decarbonization, the need for decarbonization, et cetera, et cetera. I think that we are, and how important electricity is to everything we do anymore. And we really need to look at market structures again. Capacity markets is a perfect example. Capacity markets favoring zero marginal cost generation, great for wind and solar. That's where you get the numbers that say solar is only $36. That's without an infrastructure and without storage. And those capacity markets are not incentivizing the infrastructure and the storage that we need for a reliable grid. And I think it's time to look at it again.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we are right on time. And please join me in thanking our panelists today, because I think this epitomizes exactly why we have this, to have this type of discussion, real issues, real time. So to Melanie and Rich, thank you very much for taking the time today.